At some point prior to February of 1953, Skyways had been contracted by the War Office to transport troops and their families to British colonies in the Caribbean. According to the Wikipedia article for Skyways, these flights began on the 2nd of July, 1952, and were contracted to carry a total of 4,000 troops and their families to Bermuda and Jamaica. It also claims that these flights were performed in 27 hours with stops at Keflavik and Gander. 3 to 4 flights were performed per month. I have reason to believe that some, if not all, of these numbers are incorrect. I will discuss this issue further somewhere else, but for now, take them with a grain of salt. I was unfortunately unable to find any better source of information on this issue. What is not disputed is that troops were being transported to the Caribbean by Skyways aircraft, and that is most relevant to the rest of this video. Alpha was scheduled to depart London for another trooping flight on February 1st. The day prior, Foxtrot Alpha was to be moved from its hangar at London Stansted Airport and taken to a dispersal point elsewhere at the airport to have its DF loop calibrated. The aircraft was towed tail first by a tractor to the dispersal point. If you'll remember from earlier, the storm responsible for the North Sea flood would strike during the 31st, and strong winds were already present at this time. Despite this, the mechanics responsible for the aircraft had failed to fit gust locks to the elevator. While the aircraft was being towed across the runway, a wind gust caught the elevators and slammed them down to the fully depressed position. The cables connecting the elevators to the control column were, of course, moved as well. A mechanic sitting in one of the pilot's seats while holding the control column had the column wrenched from his hands as it violently slammed into the instrument panel. The mechanic fitted the aileron nuisance bar to try and secure the controls and prevent another incident. He had apparently failed to recognize the true cause of the control column shift, as no elevator gust locks were fitted. As a result, another gust caught the elevator and caused the control column to slam forward again, this time with enough force to snap the nuisance bar in two. After the second incident, gust locks were fitted and the plane was returned to the hangar. The report is vague on what damage was done to the instrument panel. It states that both blind flying panels were removed and an unspecified number of instruments were changed. All instruments were tested and the blind flying panels were replaced. I looked at the illustrations from the York pilots and flight engineers' notes to get a better idea of what damage was done to the instrument panel. The blind flying panel included items like the artificial horizon, altimeter, and the heading, turn, and vertical speed indicators. These panels were severely damaged and it needed to be replaced. It should be noted that there don't appear to be any backup blind flying instruments located elsewhere in the cockpit. Potentially also affected were the air supply, brake, and autopilot pressure gauges, the DR compass repeater and the heading indicator, as well as the radio altimeter. Damage to the elevator control system may have also occurred, though the report considered this unlikely. The plane would have been due to leave within 24 hours of the wind gust incident, and repairs appear to have been completed in time. These were inspected and tested by an unlicensed airframe inspector who found the aircraft to be serviceable. The report found no apparent reason to question this conclusion. The plane departed Stansted for La Hez in the Azores at 11:06 a.m. on the 1st of February. It was carrying 6 crew and 33 passengers for a total of 39. Behind the controls was Captain Donald Nichols, a decorated RAF veteran. He was 30 years old and, as of January 31st, had a total of 5,590 flying hours, of which 550 were flown in the York in the 6 months prior to the accident. He had passed his last flight check in November of the previous year. He had no previous experience flying across the Atlantic. To Captain Nichols' right was 30-year-old First Officer Peter Walton, who had a total of 2,106 flying hours as of January 31st, 455 of which were in the York during the 6 months prior to the accident. He had also passed his last flight check in November of 1952. Also, like Captain Nichols, he had no prior experience flying across the Atlantic. Behind First Officer Walton was 31-year-old Navigating Officer Alex Chopping. He had flown 4,770 hours as navigator, including 423 in the 6 months prior to the accident. Unlike the pilots, he did have prior experience crossing the Atlantic. He had made 5 flights over the Atlantic during the previous 6 months, including 1 flight between La Hez and Gander. To the left and below Navigating Officer Chopping was 32-year-old Radio Officer John Davis. He had flown 3,139 hours as radio operator, including 501 hours in the 6 months prior to the accident. He had the same North Atlantic experience as Navigating Officer Chopping. Outside of the cockpit was 25-year-old air hostess Pamela Newton. She had completed 3,475 hours as an air hostess and had been aboard 2 previous flights across the Atlantic. Interestingly, she also had attained 36 flying hours as a pilot previously, though the circumstances under which these were attained are unknown. Beyond the usual 5 crew members, a 6th engineering officer was on board the aircraft. It is not entirely clear what purpose he served, as the York has no need for a flight engineer. Based on context, I believe the purpose of this position was to service the aircraft while it was on the ground during stopovers. No spare seat for a 6th crew member is provided, so he likely sat in the passenger cabin. Serving this role was 39-year-old engineering officer Raymond Lawrence. He had served 2,600 hours in this role and had been aboard 5 flights between the UK and Gander previously. Beyond the 6 crew members, 33 passengers were on board. These were presumably troops and their families. The report mentions a passenger manifest, but the PDF copy of the report does not include any appendices or figures from the report in which this might have been included. No other source I was able to locate had these parts of the report, and thus I don't know what the identities of these passengers were. No additional freight beyond the passenger baggage was carried. Foxtrot Alpha left the chaos of the UK in the immediate aftermath of the North Sea flood at 11:06 GMT. The plane would proceed to La Hez, completing this approximately 1,600-mile journey at 19:13 GMT, or 5:13 p.m. local time. The crew had been on duty for at least 9 hours at this point. The rules set out by LAC for Skyways and its crews stated that crews should take at least 9 hours of rest after 9 hours on duty. It was recommended that captains should not endanger the plane or its occupants due to crew fatigue. It appears that these were recommendations that captains were allowed to deviate from to some extent. After the plane landed, Engineering Officer Lawrence exited the plane and went about preparing the aircraft for its next leg. During the process, he was observed by local ground crew. According to them, he climbed on top of the fuselage in order to fill the fuel and water tanks. According to the fuel receipt signed by Lawrence, 2,085 gallons were loaded aboard the aircraft. 50 to 60 gallons of water were also loaded on board, though how this was determined was not stated in the report. The maximum fuel load for the York is 2,478 gallons, while the load taken on board Foxtrot Alpha was 2,085 gallons. The remaining 393 gallons were likely left over from the previous flight, but this is not directly stated in the report. The next leg of the flight was around 1,550 miles long. Using the fuel consumption calculations provided in the manual confirms that this would have been a more than sufficient level of fuel for this journey. Of more interest is how this fuel was loaded, but we'll explore that later. For Another detail provided by local mechanics was that some sort of issue had occurred while the crew were starting the engines. The crew had noticed some sort of abnormal vibration from the starboard inner engine. Engineering Officer Lawrence was sent to investigate the issue. With the help of local mechanics, he decided to replace 6 spark plugs. The engines were started again, and the issue was apparently resolved. The plane would be on the ground at La Hez for a total of 4 hours and 12 minutes. None of this time appears to have involved crew rest, and regardless, the recommended minimum of 9 hours rest after 9 hours on duty had been ignored. The crew had been on duty for 13 hours at this point. The plane departed La Hez for Gander at 23:25 GMT, or 9:25 p.m. local time, with a takeoff weight of 68,898 pounds, just below the maximum takeoff weight of 70,000 pounds. At this point, I think we should take a closer look at the route Foxtrot Alpha was taking to Jamaica. It is not stated how Foxtrot Alpha was expected to reach Jamaica. Obviously, the plane was expected to stop at La Hez, but based on a report for another incident in the region, the plane was likely going to stop at Bermuda, as this was the closest refueling stop available between La Hez and the Caribbean. Anyone following this route on a map might be confused as to why the plane was flying to Gander, as a direct flight to Bermuda should have been possible for the York. It is not stated why this route was chosen for Foxtrot Alpha. One possible theory is the length of the respective routes. A direct flight between La Hez and Bermuda is approximately 2,150 miles, while a flight to Bermuda via Gander would require 2 flights, one 1,550 miles long, and the other 1,250 miles. Possibly there might be some desire to shorten the legs of individual flights. Another possible reason would be to keep the aircraft closer to land. While Engineer Lawrence was preparing the aircraft for the next leg to Gander, another crewman had gone to receive a weather report. This report indicated that broken cloud with tops of 8,000 feet would be present throughout the route. Northwesterly winds of 20 to 25 knots were present in the earlier parts of the route. No risk of turbulence or icing were expected. Towards the end of the flight, weather would deteriorate. A cold front was passing over Newfoundland in an easterly direction and would be encountered by Foxtrot Alpha during the latter stages of the flight. Poor visibility and severe icing would be expected at this point. The exact flight path of Foxtrot Alpha is unknown. A detailed reconstruction of the flight path was created by an official from the Ministry of Civil Aviation and provided to the court and listed in the report as Figure 1. Unfortunately, Figure 1 has something in common with Foxtrot Alpha in that it has vanished without a trace. It is not included at the end of the report PDF, and I can't find it anywhere on the internet. The report considered this reconstruction to be accurate and thus also believed the navigation of Foxtrot Alpha to have been done correctly. The intended route was supposed to follow a rumline track from La Hez to St. John's, then turn towards Gander. The altitude the aircraft would fly at is contradicted in the report. The introduction states that Foxtrot Alpha would fly at 8,000 feet, while the weather section of the report suggests the plane had been given permission to climb to 10,000 feet less than an hour after takeoff. The plane was expected to send a Positional Operational Meteorological Aircraft Report, or POMAR, every hour. These contained a position report and a local meteorological report. It appears that a POMAR required at least 15 minutes in order to be created and sent. The first POMAR from Foxtrot Alpha was received at 0:10 GMT on February 2nd. 4 more POMARs would be sent between the first POMAR and 4:25. The location of the first 3 POMARs is not stated in the report. Presumably they were included in the missing Figure 1. The 5th POMAR is provided in the report. This was sent at 4:25 and gave the location at 4:10 at a latitude of 44 degrees, 32 minutes north, longitude 41 degrees 38 minutes west. The weather report given by Foxtrot Alpha indicated that the forecast from Lahez was mostly accurate. Cloud tops were between 7,000 and 8,000 feet, while Foxtrot Alpha was flying at 10,000 feet. Nothing abnormal was noted at this time or any time prior during the flight. About 3 hours after Foxtrot Alpha left Lahez, November 75416, a DC-4 belonging to Transocean Airlines and flown by Captain Ray Hoffman, departed Santa Maria in the Azores, also bound for Gander. The plane was following a similar route to Foxtrot Alpha. Captain Hoffman reported similar weather conditions to Foxtrot Alpha. At 5:31 GMT, Chesley Fowler, a radio officer employed by the Canadian Department of Transport at OAC Gander, was on duty. Radio Officer Davis had given Foxtrot Alpha's last POMAR a little over an hour ago, and the sixth POMAR of the flight could be expected at any minute now. The plane was likely hundreds of miles east of St. John's, and further still from Fowler's station at Gander. At this range, communication from Foxtrot Alpha needed to be sent in Morse code via radio telegraphy. Sure enough, Foxtrot Alpha would begin transmitting a message. It was not the message he expected. It began with a rather concerning prefix. This indicated that the following message was an urgency signal. According to the FAA, an urgency signal is sent when pilots believe there is uncertainty with regards to the safety of the aircraft. It should be noted that an urgency signal is distinct from and less severe than a distress signal, which indicates imminent and grave danger. Regardless, an urgency signal being sent from an aircraft hundreds of miles away from land is highly concerning. The exact contents of the signal are not provided in the report. However, the contents are summarized. Following the urgency prefix, the location of the aircraft at 5:30 GMT was given as 46 degrees, 15 minutes north, 46 degrees, 32 minutes west. Fowler described this message as follows. Readability fair but distinct. Sending good and speed of operating steady, normal, and good. There did not appear to be any hurry or increase in operating speed from the aircraft. After giving the location of the aircraft, Radio Officer Davis would have been expected to give the reason for the urgency call. Rather than complete the urgency call, he immediately began sending the following message. SOS indicated that the situation had suddenly escalated to warrant a distress call. Even more concerning was the abrupt end of the message. According to Fowler, this message was sent at a faster pace than the urgency call and terminated abruptly, quote, giving the impression that the transmitting station had gone off the air, end quote. Nothing more was heard from Foxtrot Alpha. Minutes later, at 5:35 GMT, 1:35 a.m. local time, the Rescue Coordination Center at Halifax was informed of the situation. All stations in the region were subsequently informed of the situation as well. Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft were dispatched to the area to search for Foxtrot Alpha, as well as U.S. Coast Guard vessels already in the area. By the time the RCAF and unnamed American aircraft had arrived, the cold front, which had been moving east, had reached the search area. It is not stated when the aircraft arrived. The aircraft would experience severe icing and poor visibility, hampering search efforts. The report does a very poor job detailing the search. The section of the report on the search consists of only 2 paragraphs, of which only one deals with the search itself. Based on other sources, it is clear that a number of very important details were omitted in the report. To make up for this, I had to rely on a couple of other sources. According to a New York Times article from February 3rd, quoted in Larry Kush's Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, a British freighter called the Woodward was in the area and searched for the York but found no trace. The sea state was poor, with massive waves being whipped up by 75-mile-per-hour winds. The article states that the last radio contact was made 359 miles southeast of Gander. Based on the coordinates given by Foxtrot Alpha and listed in the report, the distance between Gander and the last known location is around 415 miles. I would be more inclined to believe the report's account since it gives an exact location, though the New York Times number might have some interesting implications. The most likely reason for the discrepancy is some sort of error made during the reporting of an unfolding story. It might also be possible that some sort of confusion amongst the searchers led to them believing the aircraft was closer to Newfoundland than it was, which may have affected the outcome of the search. Without any further info on this issue, I can't really say why these two distances are given. Though not mentioned in the report was the discovery of an oil patch by the US CGC Campbell a day after the accident. This also appears to be from newspaper reporting. The Campbell apparently found an oil patch and dye markers 120 miles southwest of the last known position. It is possible that this slick didn't belong to Foxtrot Alpha. An air crash isn't the only possible source of oil in the ocean. Two details suggest this might have been from Foxtrot Alpha. First, based on maps of ocean currents in the Atlantic, this oil slick was located in the Labrador Current. This is a flow of cold water traveling south from the Arctic. In the area in which Foxtrot Alpha crashed, it flows to the southwest. The time when Foxtrot Alpha crashed and the time when the US CGC Campbell found the oil slick is unknown, so estimates are a bit difficult. My estimates based on the typical speed of these currents suggests 120 miles seems a bit far for a single day, however. Second, the presence of dye markers would suggest that the oil slick was connected to an emergency. Dye markers are small packets of dye that dissolve in water, creating a bright, clearly visible aid to searchers. The only reason these would be used is in an emergency, either by deliberate use by a survivor or by breaking open in a crash. It is not known why this was not mentioned in the report. This seems like a rather egregious omission, given that this may be the only trace of Foxtrot Alpha ever found. One possible reason is that the court didn't call the commander or any other crewman of the Campbell as a witness. The only members of the U.S. Coast Guard who provided an affidavit to the court were Captain Hoffman of the Transocean DC-4 and the commanding officer of the U.S. CGC Yakutat. The search covered 68,000 square miles. How the search was executed was apparently documented in the missing Figure 1. Search aircraft flew a total of 190 hours combined between February 2nd and February 4th. This may seem like a rather short search, especially given that part of the search was hindered by bad weather. Then again, the weather may have been a factor in the length of the search. If anyone survived the initial crash, they likely would have succumbed to the weather before rescue could arrive. Short searches like this were not uncommon in similar accidents, as we will see later. No trace of Foxtrot Alpha, beyond the possible oil slick, was ever found. Regardless, the Ministry of Transport sought answers for the disappearance of Foxtrot Alpha and its 39 occupants.